I'm Mark Trexler with the Climatographers. In this video, I'm going to walk you through a more detailed version of Duncan Austin's new paper called Greenwish. And this is not a scripted video, so forgive me my occasional slips of the tongue. But this will offer you sort of the opportunity to simply follow along in the video rather than necessarily having to scroll through the climate web. So I thought that would be useful. The other video just gives you a quick walkthrough of how to navigate this paper or any paper in the climate web. And I thought that a backdrop of Ed Hawkins' sort of most recent visualization of the temperature record would make an interesting backdrop for this particular video. So let's go ahead and get into Duncan's paper. This is a very useful paper that pulls together a lot of different threads of different climate relevant conversations. And the key point that I want to make in this video is that you can think of this as sort of a one-off paper where Duncan has written this, and now, let's go out and do something with it. A much more useful way to think about it, I would suggest, is that it is pulling together the threads of dozens of other conversations that actually have been around in many cases for years, a few years, a lot of years, small conversations, large conversations. And if we wanted to actually implement or try and move forward with the ideas that Duncan is putting forward in his paper, we would want to be able to take advantage of all of the different collective intelligence that is already out there. And that's what the climate web is really trying to do. And that's what I'm going to, in some ways, walk you through in this video. So we can see here that Duncan's paper is split up into basically four parts: the rise of market environmentalism, the state of today's environment, the three problems with today's idea of sustainable business, and then getting into conclusions. We've also created an index entry for greenwishing. And by the way, I wish I'd come up with the idea and the term greenwishing. It is so superior to greenwashing for all kinds of things, since greenwashing has such a negative connotation. There's an interesting question as to where greenwashing and greenwishing overlap and how you transition from one to the other. But the term greenwishing, I think, is great. And in searching, I can't find any other use of the term to date. And I suspect that it will become a much more common term in climate change and sustainability circles. So my hat's off to Duncan for coming up, as far as I know, with the term Greenwish. So let's go ahead and jump in. You can see here that there are several literatures that this is part of. So, if you click on one of these other thoughts, you get the climate change versus sustainability literature. You can jump over to that particular index entry. You can also click on the climate policy advocacy by business literature. You can click further into the investor climate policy advocacy literature. These are all literatures that have been around in one form or another for quite a while, even though they are a very small part of the overall sort of business and climate change conversation. So what Duncan does is start out with the idea of the importance of market environmentalism, and notes that, as policy started to falter in the 1990s, and I definitely agree with this, having gotten into this field in 1988 and immediately seeing how market mechanisms and carbon offsets and cap and trade became sort of key to this whole topic, all of which can really potentially be characterized as greenwishing. So Duncan basically argues that market environmentalism has been a key sort of force in the whole sustainable business conversation. I agree with that. You'll see here that some of these thoughts have asterisks. That means that there is more information in that thought, whether text in the notes field or other links. The little green dot suggests there's another link there. In this case, an index entry to the win-win as sustainability messaging. And you can go in and explore sort of that other messaging. Of course, the win-win messaging in sustainability and climate change has gotten bigger and bigger, and the argument being that people won't pay attention to negative messaging, but there's some real downsides, as Duncan points out, to the win-win messaging as well. So, but his point of the rise of market environmentalism, I think, is well taken, and I don't think anybody would really have any problems with that idea. Duncan then moves into the idea of sort of the state of today's environment. He doesn't spend a lot of time on this for obvious reasons. There are a few things that, and if you click on some of the thoughts here, you can jump to the citations that are in the report. But I think we can take for granted that the state of today's environment is not good. And even as sort of the whole sustainable business conversation has evolved, a lot of the indicators that we think of in the context of sustainability and climate change and other topics have gotten worse. Now, in the climate web, you can explore all of this stuff, even though I'm not going to focus on it here. The climate impacts deep dive takes you into almost an infinity of information there. The dangerous climate change deep dive, same thing. The climate systemic risk deep dive. All of these are topics that are very relevant to Duncan's paper, and that if one wanted to really start a larger conversation around the premises of Duncan's paper and try and pull other people into the conversation, there's a lot of material there that could be made easy use of because it's already pulled together and organized. I thought it made sense to point out that there's the link here to Stefan's 2007 paper that Duncan references. But one of the things that Duncan doesn't specifically talk about is the topic of planetary boundaries. But we do have the link here in that thought to the planetary boundary literature in the climate web. And if I click on that thought, you'll see that it jumps right to that planetary boundaries index entry, which organizes a ton of great information. So just showing you very quickly sort of how this works in terms of the different links that you can explore associated with Duncan's paper. The points made in Duncan's paper are summarized in the thoughts themselves. There is nothing specifically from Duncan's paper in the notes field. I've used the notes field to sort of build on some of the ideas and give you additional links to explore some of those ideas. So that's the second part of Duncan's paper, the state of today's environment. Then you get into what is really, the meat of this paper. And Duncan is making the argument that there are three problems with today's business sustainability. The first is that the whole idea of profit and being sort of half-baked in the context of missing externalities and the idea of shareholder value maximization has had a huge influence, and that the whole idea of sustainability metrics has simply not been able to make up for it. And we'll dig into that more in just a second. The second being that the sustainability movement has contributed to the idea that this is all free and easy, and that that's not necessarily a great message. And this has been talked about by a lot of people. The last being, and this is sort of where you really get into the substance of what Duncan is arguing, is that if you think about this issue systemically and think about climate change, and if you take a systems view to climate change, you quickly understand that the real thing that the sustainable business community should be advocating for is public policy, as opposed to necessarily focusing on reporting, their internal sustainability measures. Internal sustainability measures are great, but they are not scaling in terms of actually leading to a more sustainable system. And that's the basic point that Duncan is making with his paper. So if you click on each of these in turn, you'll see, and even just right now, you can certainly expand this video on your screen to see a full screen version, or if you right click on the tab, you can get it in your browser in a separate tab and see it in full screen, so you can actually read these things as you go along. The basic argument that the market forces have exploded in recent decades, that today's idea of profit calculations remain half-baked and incomplete. His term, what's missing, no surprise here, the idea of externalities. And as he notes, it's sort of weird because unpriced externalities exceed the global GDP. So, is it an externality if it really exceeds global GDP, so that the stuff that you're including in the profit and loss spreadsheet that you're working on is less than the environmental externality? What does that really mean, and how do you adapt to that fact is one of the questions that Duncan is raising. So you can just sort of walk through these different thoughts on your screen. Now, I'm not going to read all of it, since you can do it in a few seconds or freeze the video to take a look in more detail. But as you can see, in many cases, there are green dots here suggesting there are links or additional, and the asterisk suggesting there's additional text. So when he notes that Milton Friedman in 1970 had sort of a pivotal piece on this whole topic, you can actually go and simply click on that link and read Milton Friedman's op-ed in the New York Times. I think it was in the New York Times that Duncan is referring to. And so you can do that seamlessly with lots of different issues and topics here in the climate web. He also gets into the idea that basically what's happened here is that neoliberalism has captured environmentalism. This too is not a new idea. There hasn't been a massive discussion of this, but you can find relevant discussion of this through the index entry if you want to go down that path. And you can see that this is linked to other index entries: causes of climate change, barriers to climate action and climate progress. And you can just sort of see some of the other index entries that show up here on your screen. And I'm just going to go back to where I was. I should note that if you do play around with this online, this backspace key doesn't work as well in the online version. You can only backspace for one screen. I talk about that in the first thought and in the navigation, the 2-minute video. So take a look at that if you want to really start navigating this in the climate web itself. So if we keep going here, and one of the points being made, I'm realizing there's a typo here. I'm just going to fix it while I'm here. One of the points that Duncan makes, and this is a really key point, I think, is that it's one thing to say, well, what's the harm in all of these different sustainability metrics, et cetera, but there's an opportunity cost. And so all of the effort on corporate footprints and all of this kind of thing, if it's not actually contributing to climate change mitigation, it's not just, well, how can it hurt? It's not that it hurts per se, but there is an opportunity cost to this stuff. And so if you're being distracted from the really important topics, that has a cost. So there's a lot of stuff you can explore in this section of the paper, and lots of different links that we provide for you if you want to explore those further. So we've gone through the idea of sort of the half-baked profit measures. The idea of the sustainability movement has contributed to the idea that this is all free. The third big part of this paper gets into the systemic view issue, and that if we took a systemic view of this, we would take a different approach to what the sustainable business community should be doing. And I agree with this entirely. It's a topic that's been around for years, and yet it gets relatively little attention for obvious reasons. Companies would generally much rather focus on their internal sustainability behaviors than on their corporate policy advocacy. In talking to the head of sustainability for a Fortune 100 company, for example, he loved to talk about the things that they were doing within their sustainability program, their sustainability plan. When I asked him about the topic of policy advocacy, his response was, well, look, that's way beyond my pay grade. We don't have any influence on that. And that's really one of the issues that Duncan is getting at here, and one of the things that makes it really difficult to link corporate sustainability behavior to policy advocacy and systems change with it, which is at the end of the day what, in all presumably is needed to tackle climate change. A key point that Duncan is making here in this part of the paper is that the challenge here is no longer what can individual companies do internally. It's what can the private sector do to drive systemic change. And that gets into the whole topic of collective action, which is a very different focus than we have tended to see companies focus on. And so he's suggesting that disclosure today is not so much about carbon emissions or your carbon footprint, but to use the term coined by InfluenceMap, the organization InfluenceMap in the UK, it's really about policy footprints, not carbon footprints. And I agree with that entirely, and highly recommend the work of InfluenceMap in this space, and you can access it through the links that you just saw there. Duncan makes the argument that activist investors have actually reinforcing the profit motive and nudged markets towards more short-termism, which is interesting because a lot of people are suggesting that with B Corps, et cetera, companies are becoming less short-term. So there's a tension there worth thinking about. But he basically here is simply arguing that if you need to get to systems change, then focusing too much on internal stuff, on carbon footprints, et cetera, is not the way to go, and that what's really needed is to raise the bar on the whole idea of private sector leadership on sustainability, so that bar includes policy advocacy and systemic intervention. And what's interesting right now is that very few of the sustainability standards, very few of the things like science-based targets, very few of those commitments require you to say anything about public policy and policy advocacy. So even though there is certainly a conversation about business policy advocacy today and organizations that are focused on that, and there are links to all of that in some of the different thoughts here in reviewing Duncan's paper, I think most people would agree that it is a very small part of the overall sustainable business conversation. And that's what Duncan is really calling out here, is that it needs to be a much bigger part of the sustainable business conversation. And Duncan basically concludes with the fact that companies should pledge to not compromise societal efforts to protect the planet, raises the interesting question of whether that's sufficient or whether companies should be stepping farther forward and getting to the question of, actually advocating for it rather than not impeding. Now, one of the biggest questions that Duncan raises in the paper is the idea of, well, if the whole idea of sustainable business today largely falls into the category of greenwishing, is the idea that companies can actually contribute to policy development towards systemic change, is that simply more wishful thinking? And it's a great question. It deserves a lot more attention. And there are a number of conversations that you can explore through the climate web, the InfluenceMap, the academic work of Christopher Wright and Daniel Nyberg, who tend to suggest that it's sort of an oxymoron to suggest that business can actually promote that kind of policy action. But there are actually large conversations around the topic of what is the business role in tackling climate change. And it's here in the climate web under business stepping up. And there's a huge amount of information there. But you can also explore in much more detail the topic of business opposition to climate policy. And of course, there is a significant literature there as well. And so all of these literatures and issues and topics are very relevant to the questions that Duncan is raising in his paper. So Duncan does have a couple of concluding points. I have a quote that I include here from a book that I find very interesting, very relevant to this topic, Margaret Heffernan's 2011 book, Willful Blindness, and you can jump to that in the climate web. But Margaret has a quote. The book is not about climate change, but it has a quote that I think is great. In failing to address climate change, all the forces of willful blindness come together like synchronized swimmers in a spectacular water ballet. I think it's a beautiful quote. It really encapsulates the topics and the challenges that Duncan is referring to in his paper, and really helps suggest, the importance of having a much more systematic and a much larger conversation about these topics. And I'd be happy to support such a conversation. The Climate Web is here to help support such conversations. And I'd welcome the opportunity to follow up with people who are interested in that. Thanks very much.